So I'm going to talk to you about a project that we're currently working on. It's a team of Berkeley and Stockholm Uppsala researchers. And broadly speaking, the topic is the worldwide rise of the radical right. I guess that's why we're here, as Joachim said. It's a pronounced political phenomenon across countries, across electoral systems, and particularly in Europe, we see radical right parties participating in government in a number of countries, but where one would have to include the US. Maybe some would like to include factions, at least, of the Republican Party, and perhaps factions of the Tories as well these days. The political programs of these politicians and these parties tend to glorify past times. Things were better before. They embody a strong anti-establishment message, which makes them populist. And they also, when it comes to the radical right, entail a strong anti-immigration message. So that's the broad topic. The more narrow topic today is going to be a case study of Sweden's radical right party, known as the Sweden Democrats. So we're going to ask, who are the politicians and who are the voters of this party? And I'm going to look, for data reasons, at the party's period of most rapid growth. So in 2006, this was a relatively small party. Then they doubled to the 2010 election, and then they doubled again to the 2014 elections. And our data will stop there. So we'll look at the period before the big European refugee crisis, which is often attributed to these parties. But in the last election, they obtained 17.5% of the common vote. So the basic idea for the project is to sort of start from the perhaps obvious thing that people who sympathize with parties like the Sweden Democrats tend to be low-status people in society. At least that's one hypothesis. So we'll categorize the population into relative winners and losers. So I'll focus on labor market outcomes. So that means income and jobs. Given the period that we're investigating and the party's rapid rise, I'm going to zoom in the two most important and dramatic economic events in 2006 to 2014. And that will be a set of government reforms, known in Sweden as the Make Work Pay reforms, which dramatically increased the gap of income between outsiders and insiders to the labor market. You will see this soon. The second event is going to be the financial crisis, which dramatically increased the gap in job loss risk between those insiders that are vulnerable and those that are more secure, depending on what occupations they have. And then I will also look at social outcomes, people who are marginalized in the social dimension. So contrast people who live together, married or partnered with others. And I look at people who have children and who do not have children, so are further from the sort of establishment of society. So that's the key idea. When it comes to the politicians, the question then is, who become a radical right politician, who become a Sweden Democrat politician? And I say we know very little, if maybe nothing is a better description, systematic about this issue. Hasn't been subject to much research. So we are going to do some very basic things. We are going to compare individual politicians to the population, and we're going to contrast the politicians of the radical right with the politicians of the more established other parties. And we're going to find that the Sweden Democrats dramatically overrepresent the losers, while the other parties overrepresent the winners in the way I will define them. And that will be even more true in groups that lost the most during the period of Sweden Democrat growth, i.e. 2006 to 2014. And these results extend, so they become stronger as we start disaggregating into subgroups or into smaller units than the nation as a whole. Then we're going to look at the voters. So who are the people who vote for the radical right? And here we cannot claim any originality. There are hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of such studies already. But the interest here is to make the comparison between the voters and the politicians, and that's what I'll focus on. So even though the Swedish data is great, we cannot observe individual votes. So we are going to look at places where the Sweden Democrats attract many votes. So this would be precincts or municipalities. And we'll find that on average, the party is strong in those places where there are many losers. And we will find that they grow the most where the losses were the largest in 2006 to 2014. And these results extend. If you look at individual party sympathies in surveys, they tell the same story. So comparing the results for the politicians and the voters, it looks like they are part of the same kind of citizen candidate movement. That's jargon from academia, but if you don't know it, it doesn't matter because the label gives it away. So the Sweden Democrat politicians turn out to overrepresent the same groups as their voters come from. And as we will see, this is not only descriptive representation in terms of labor market status, it's also substantive representation in that politicians and voters of the party share the same attitudes. And then towards the end, I'll speculate a little bit about the implications of this for political selection, how well democracy works. But let's wait with that. So here is the precise roadmap for my talk. Since this is a very data-intensive project, I have to tell you a little bit about the data that we're using. Then we'll go to the politicians, to the voters, speak about the conjoint results under the heading of drivers, and then discuss the implications. So we are exploiting Swedish data in different registers. So we go to the election authority, and there we find all politicians who has ever been on a ballot in any election year since 1982. So we link these data to very detailed income and socioeconomic information for the whole grown-up population over 35 years. So this comes from various registers of Statistics Sweden. So I guess people like to talk about big data these days. I guess this is big data. It's about 14 million unique individuals, many of whom we observe for 35 consecutive years. And out of these 14 million, about 200,000 are politicians, or a little more than 200,000. So we have a pretty large sample to look at. I guess it's the population, not the sample. And we're going to complement that at times with data from individual surveys. So we're going to rely on a set of representative samples of voters from 1995, and we have our own survey of all local politicians in 2017. So as further background, let me introduce this distinction between insiders and outsiders. And it's not going to be our own definition, someone else's definition. I can go into it in question time if you like. But basically, an insider is someone who has had a stable job for a number of years. An outsider has a more loose relation to the labor market. This graph shows you the disposable income of insiders, that's the dashed line, and of outsiders, that's the solid line. And I marked the year 2006, where a new center-right government rose to power on a program of making work pay. So how did they make work pay? Well, they lowered the taxes for working people, earned income tax credit for each of 5 consecutive years. And this was largely financed by cuts in various social security benefits and unemployment benefits, sickness benefits, etc. And as you can see, in a mere 6 years, from 2006 to 2012, the gap of disposable income between insiders and outsiders grew dramatically. The average number is 20%, which is a large number by any measure. And as you can see to the right, this differs depending on what kind of outsiders we're talking about. We can sort of classify people according to where they get their main income from, even though they don't have a stable employment income. And as you can see, some groups, such as the early retired, had their income relative to insiders fall by 22%, and the unemployed or economically active had it fall by 25%. Here is the other distinction in the economic dimension that I want to make, namely between vulnerable and secure job holders. So now we're talking about people who do have stable jobs. And this is not, again, our definition. It's someone else's definition, including David Dorn, who is sitting in the audience. So we're looking at the occupations of people and whether you have an occupation that is more exposed to job loss than others. And you can see here the unemployment risk of the vulnerable insiders versus the secure insiders. It's sort of always above. But then in 2008, when the financial crisis strikes, the secure insiders, they sit comfortably at 4% unemployment, whereas the vulnerable insiders go up to 8, 10, and stay up for a while. So the job loss risk really dramatically changed between these two groups in this recession. So now let us look at the politicians. Again, the question is, who becomes a Sweden Democrat politician? So I'm going to look at preponderantly the elected politicians in the 290 municipalities in Sweden. You may think, why should I worry about these local politicians? Maybe they just decide on trash collection and it's not very important. But municipalities in Sweden, as cantons in Switzerland, are very important. They are about 20% of the economy, whether you look at it from the spending side, from the employment side, or from the income tax that they use to finance their activities. I should also mention that being a local politician like this is a spare time mission. There are a couple of people who are full-time employees of the municipality, but the rest of the people have their own jobs, and they take an afternoon off to go to the council meeting in every week. So we have 51,000, roughly, such politicians who serve in the electoral periods from 2002 to 2014, which is the period we're interested in because of the Sweden Democrat growth during that period. And I should also mention, given the interpretation that I will offer, that on a Swedish party ballot, after each name, it also lists the age of the candidate, the occupation, and the residence of the candidate, so people can figure out the composition of candidates on each party's ballot just by looking at it. So let me now show you the third picture, comparing two party groups with the population. So the elected for the Sweden Democrats and the elected for all other parties. So take a look at the picture to to the left, or the part of the picture to the left. So the leftmost bar is the entire population, so it sums to 100%. I've divided it into the outsiders, as we discussed, into the vulnerable insiders, the secure insiders, the retired insiders, and students who are hard to classify in this dimension. And as you can see, the outsiders and the vulnerable insiders make up about 50% of the population, and the secure insiders about 25% of the population. Now, next, we have the Sweden Democrats. And as you can see, they are overrepresenting the outsiders. They are overrepresenting the vulnerable insiders. So rather than 50% of the population, we're talking now about 60%. And to the right, we have the other parties who instead are, composed of candidates that are 50% secure insiders, and they are underrepresenting the losing groups very dramatically. And you may think that this is just conservative parties, but if you look at the left, the Social Democrats and the former Communist Party, they look as bad as the others in this dimension. Now here is the social side of things. So here are the people who are single, have no children. It's about 30% of the population. Those that are single and have children. So altogether about 50%, and the partnered without children and partnered with children. Sweden Democrats again overrepresent the marginalized groups, and the other parties very dramatically overrepresent the conventional families that partnered with children. And of course, these things are not independent from each other, so these bars here look at what happens if you take the covariation into account, but let me leave that for a minute. So in summary, the Sweden Democrats overrepresent the outsiders, the vulnerable insiders and singles, and the other parties overrepresent the insiders, the secure insiders, and the partnered people. This is what happens over time. There's some changes in the population. What happens with the Sweden Democrat elected politicians? Well, they seem to be here replacing some of the insiders with vulnerable, some of the outsiders with vulnerable insiders. And note that this is the period of the financial crisis when these people are exposed to job loss, as I showed you earlier in the aggregate. Whereas if you look at the composition of the other parties, they don't seem to react much. It's pretty much a constant over time. Now let me disaggregate the picture a little bit. So how does the representation look in subgroups? So I'm going to show you measures of the overrepresentation of certain groups in the Sweden Democrats relative to the other parties. And I'm going to order these subgroups by the size of the income loss that they incurred in the period when the Sweden Democrats grew during this make work pay reforms. So I've ordered them according to those numbers that you saw in the first diagram on the insider-outsider incomes. And as you can see, the Sweden Democrats very much overrepresent the groups, two groups that took the largest hit during the 2006-2014, namely the early retired and the unemployed or the economically inactive. And the number on the vertical scale here, about 6 or 5, it means that there are 6 times as many early retired in the Sweden Democrat delegation as in the other party delegation. So it's no small overrepresentation. So it looks as if the groups that are hit the hardest are most engaged in politics. As a result, one is sort of tempted to say, but of course I cannot prove that. But It's the description. This picture shows you what happens when you disaggregate things geographically. So on the horizontal axis, I measure the share of outsiders in the municipal population. These are aggregates of municipalities just to make the figure easier to read. And as you can see in different municipalities, they range from 25% to about 47% in the share of outsiders in the population. On the vertical axis, I have the share of outsiders among the elected politicians. And the triangles here represent the parties other than the Sweden Democrats. This is the 45-degree line. It's not the 45-degree line because the diagram is a bit asymmetric. But if the two kept pace, you will move along this line. And the other parties do not move along this line. They do respond a little bit when the share of outsiders in the population goes up. But the slope is smaller here, so they don't respond proportionately. Whereas the Sweden Democrats, as we already know, always overrepresent the outsiders relative to the other parties. And as the share of outsiders goes up, they respond more vigorously with a larger share of outsiders among their politicians. And if you look instead at the share of vulnerable insiders, the people who took the hit of job loss during the recession, and if you look at singles and do the same exercise, you get the same result. Right? So now let me turn to the voters, which is, as I said, a bit less original, but I guess this classification of the population is following what I just did for the politicians. And we will see that the results kind of echo the results that we find for the politicians. So here what we do is that we start from the individual data in the population registers, and then we aggregate up to the precinct or the municipality. The precinct is the smallest unit in which we can measure things. So Sweden has about 6,000 precincts, so each precinct is about 1,200 people on average. And the municipality is this larger administrative unit. And we'll find that the Sweden Democrats are strong in precisely those precincts and the municipalities where there are many losers. And if we look at Sweden Democrat growth during 2006 to 2014, we find that the Sweden Democrat vote share grew more where the economic losses were the largest during that period. Of course, there can be some omitted factors that drive these correlations, but then we try every page in the book, meaning that those hundreds and hundreds of studies who have identified drivers of radical right voting, and whatever variables that we try, we still find the same results. So I think these are the most convincing pictures. So this illustrates how the Sweden Democrat vote share co-varies with some measures of losses or losers within a municipality. Okay, so we are taking out the municipal mean, both of the Sweden Democrat vote share and of the measure of losses. Just look at the precinct variation within that municipality. And as you can see, there is a positive slope here when we look at inequality. Similarly, when we look at the share of vulnerable insiders, there's a pretty drastic positive covariation. We look at the share of singles, and we look at the share of single outsiders. It's hard not to be impressed by these positive relations. Now, we can also look at what happens over time. Again, this is within municipality across precinct variation. So this is for the year 2002 for the economic measures, inequality, and the share of vulnerable insiders. And there's not too much of a relation. But at this point, the Sweden Democrats are not a factor. And the economic crisis and these reforms have not hit yet. we go over time to 2006, and in particular to 2010, you see that this relation becomes much stronger, which sort of suggests, at least to me, that the events that I spoke about has a big role in what we're observing. You can do this by municipality rather than precinct, so a larger unit. And here I'm just showing you the growth in Sweden Democrat support related to the growth in inequality over the time period, or to the share of vulnerable insiders at the beginning of the recession. And there you see a positive relation again. When you look at the average share of singles, you don't see much, but there were no major social shocks to the marriage market over this period, unlike for the economic side of things. This shows you a map of Sweden. You're not supposed to get much out of this. I guess the left map shows you where the growth of the radical right was the largest. And you don't know much about Swedish geography, but I guess you can see that the neighbors to Denmark and the neighbors to Norway up there are not very reliable areas. And so that's where you see the biggest growth here. And in the two other maps, I've drawn the share of vulnerable insiders, those who are subject to more job loss, and the growth of inequality over the period. And what you see is that, there is a sort of, to the eye, there is a bit of a correlation, but the most important part of this map is showing you that this is not just a regional dummy, that there are certain regions that dominate. It's a patchwork of strong and small things that are distributed all over the country. So what we're picking up is genuine sort of covariation at the municipal level rather than at the regional level. So, as I said, these results are statistically robust. So this relation between the Sweden Democrat gains and the economic losses hold up if we do things like removing the immigrant vote. Sweden is a big immigrant country like Switzerland. If we use only the national inequality shifts rather than the local inequality shifts, which are arguably more given to a given region or precinct. It holds if you study different levels of elections, etc., etc. And as I mentioned, we also hold constant the conspicuous drivers from research on the radical right, so local immigration, globalization as manifested in occupation and in industries locally, local crime, education, political context. Nothing kills the relations that I've shown you. Perhaps interestingly, for those who know about the contact hypothesis, local immigration does not seem to be a significant driver of Sweden Democrat growth. And we are trying a dozen different measures of local immigration. We look at the level of immigrants, the recent changes in immigrants, the labor market impacts of immigration on jobs or on industries. We look at media coverage of immigration. Whatever we try, we don't find a strong relation, and not even a positive relation. So let me try and interpret this. So how do we think about these joint findings for politicians and for voters? Well, to us, the Sweden Democrat politicians look like citizen candidates. When the competing hypothesis could be that there is a bunch of people who look to become politicians. They have tried in other parties, they failed, and now they see their chance and they engage in this new party and they become representatives for them. But if you look at the Sweden Democrat politicians, they are new entrants. So, in fact, only 2% of them were ever elected for another party, and only 9% were ever on the ballot for another party. And if you compare that to the established parties, these numbers are much lower. So these are new entrants of politicians. So the other side of the citizen candidate movement is that, the idea is that people who share the same labor market status or social status as you're a more credible candidate because you find yourself in the same situation, and therefore people are more prone to vote for the party when they run such candidates. But that's what is known as descriptive representation. People look the same. Do they also think the same? So is there substantive representation as well? So do Sweden Democrat politicians and voters share the same views? And here I'm going to rely on survey data. So I'm going to look at two conspicuous questions, which are verbatim the same, posed to a representative sample of voters and the full population of local politicians in the same year, namely 2017. That's where we have our politician survey. So I'm asking people in the Sweden Democrats up here and in the other parties, sympathizers or active politicians, whether they think that one should strongly restrict immigration. And for the other parties, about 20% of the voters, the sympathizers, think so. Of the politicians, 10 to 12%. And the politicians are more restrained than their voters. For the Sweden Democrats, instead, 80% of the people who sympathize with the Sweden Democrats think that restricting immigration is a good idea, and 90% or 95% of the politicians. So this is pretty large difference. And note that the Sweden Democrat politicians are sort of more activist than their voters. Here is a measure of anti-establishment attitudes, distrust in the national parliament. Again, in the other parties, about 20%, a little fewer among the politicians express distrust in these national political institutions. Of the Sweden Democrats, 60% do so, or 70% among the politicians. And again, the politicians are more anti than the voters on the other side of the 45-degree line. So it's not just descriptive, but substantive representation. And if you look at other things, such as generalized trust in other people, you find the same pattern. Now, let me just look a little bit, since I have a few minutes left, on what happened over time with these particular attitudes. So this graph, the uppermost graph, shows what happens with these anti-establishment attitudes in the form of distrust in the national parliament over time. And it wasn't that it was increasing over the period of Sweden Democrat growth in Sweden. On the contrary, the share of people who expressed such distrust went down from 37% to 23% in the population at large. But if you disaggregate people into outsiders versus insiders, as we have done in this discussion of winners and losers, then you see that precisely during the time of these make-work reforms, the outsiders start to express a greater distrust in national parliament than the insiders do. This is the relative effect here. Not so for the vulnerable and secure insiders. This is a similar exercise for anti-immigrant attitudes. Again, this is before the big refugee crisis in 2015. So in fact, anti-immigrant attitudes went down from the beginning of the period, or at least was constant over the period up until 2014 when our investigation stops. And here we don't see any differential across insiders and outsiders. So what's going on? Probably this is going on. We are here looking at declared sympathizers, the anti-immigration preferences of declared Sweden Democrat sympathizers. And among people who have moderate anti-immigration or pro-immigration attitudes, you don't see virtually any change in the sympathies for Sweden Democrats, but for those with strong anti-immigration preferences, you do see a dramatic increase. This is not surprising, but I think the interpretation of this is that the salience of these issues suddenly became a major factor that made people with anti-immigrant attitudes go with the Sweden Democrats towards the end of our investigation period. So why are the losers drawn to the Sweden Democrats? Well, we don't know. However good our registered data are, we cannot use them to look into the heads of people. But it's very plausible that since they are losers in society, at least in a relative sense, they perceive a low or falling status in society. So it's natural to think that this may make them less trusting in existing political elites. They may socially identify with their in-group, other people in the same predicament. And then it's natural to think that you charge some out-groups. Those out-groups could be the establishment or it could be the immigrants. And when the Sweden Democrats present them with a message that blame the losses that they have incurred on the establishment or the immigrants, it's plausible that they get attracted. So I think we're talking about a complex mix of economic and social causes. This idea, maybe we'll hear more about it in future sessions, whether it is, is it cultural factors or is it economic factors? It's the wrong question. It's got to be both. It's just a question of trying to fit them together. It's a stupid question to think it's one or the other. It's like saying it's only nurture or it's only nature that brings persistence across generations. But I would say that there is a conspicuous timing of these economic shocks that I emphasized and the Sweden Democrat growth. That is hard to escape. So, does democracy do its job in Sweden? I mean, it's hard to escape the fact that the Sweden Democrats gives voice to groups that didn't have much representation, or at least they were seriously underrepresented in the past. So, in some sense, that makes democracy more inclusive. But then, maybe there's another side of that coin. So we are looking at how politicians in Sweden Democrats and the other parties compare when you start looking at auxiliary traits. This is the last graph that I'll show you. It shows how politician characteristics, various types of abilities, compare across the Sweden Democrats and other party politicians. So farthest to the left, this just shows that on average Sweden Democrat politicians have 50% less political experience. Fine, it's a new party, so it's a natural result. But if you look at to what extent elected candidates have public sector experience, you see the same. That public sector experience means having worked in the public sector, and since the municipalities are involved with running the public sector, this should be a valuable thing for voters to have, potentially. So it's 30 percentage points less among the Sweden Democrats compared to the other parties. 25 percentage points less have a university education. Once we look at other measures of abilities, this is a measure of ability from the labor market. The Sweden Democrat politicians are 1/2 standard deviation below the other party politicians. This shows the motivation of people. This is from the survey with the local politicians that we have, the so-called Perry score. So, is it private gain or is it public service that drives people's motives to do things in life? Again, the Sweden Democrat politicians are about 1/2 a standard deviation below the other party politicians. This is a measure of morality. We like our politicians to have high morals, presumably. So this is the so-called hexaco scale that measures people's integrity by a number of questions. And the Sweden Democrat politicians have a quarter standard deviation worse morals than the other party politicians. So it looks a bit like a representation ability trade-off. Growth of the Sweden Democrats raised the representation of these losing groups, but they weakened political selection on ability. And this political selection on ability is something that we have highlighted, the same co-authors, in earlier work, which basically shows that Sweden works very much like an inclusive meritocracy. And that seems to be now challenged by the rise of the party. So I'm not going to take any normative stance on this. I'm just pointing to the trade-off, and you'll be the judge, or someone else will be the judge about how you want to think about this. So let me summarize. I have 0 minutes left, so I'll try to do it quickly. So we study the Sweden Democrats' politicians and voters. I think we add to earlier findings on how job losses and austerity reforms may help shape the populist vote. We also show that the same factors, lead to supply of new politicians in the radical right. More generally, we uncover how the radical right overrepresents losing groups among politicians and voters. And we interpret this as a kind of a citizen candidate response, where economic losses, falling trust, and perhaps social identification may interact. So the bottom line is that the populist rise looks like a representation ability trade-off. And then finally, in the discussions about the radical right, one tends to blame its rise on too much inclusion in policy, in that case, migration policy. Thinking about these make-work-pay reforms and the austerity that went with them, it seems that the fuel of the rise of the Sweden Democrats in Sweden may have been too little inclusion in policy, in that case, in fiscal policy. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
So, thank you for that fascinating lecture, Torsten. That was fantastic. Now, one question I had while you were speaking, in earlier research you showed that the politicians in power before the Sweden Democrats came along looked remarkably like supermen in terms of their educational attainment, earnings, and all other skills. So Sweden seems to have a political system that systematically selects people who do tremendously well in their professions, earn a lot, and even within families, it's the brother or sister that's the most accomplished educationally that becomes a politician. And some of what the Sweden Democrats seem to do is just undo this, to my mind, remarkable emphasis on accomplishment and merit in the selection of politicians. So I'm wondering how much of this is just about a very Swedish, very admirable and amazing peculiarity that's being undone, and how much of this can be generalized. Do you have any thoughts on that?
It's a very good question. And, I think one can speculate about that. But, we need to do this kind of research in other countries as well. In a few places, it's possible, like Finland, Denmark, also have populist radical right parties who have been around for a while, and we can, with the registers in those countries, we can have a look, and there is ongoing data collection to make that feasible. I would love to do it for Italy. Maybe we can get the Social Security Administration to give us the data. Tito Boeri, who was the head of it, has now resigned. But, people at the Social Security Administration seem reluctant under the current regime to give us the data to investigate that kind of thing. Can I show you one thing? This is not planned. So I didn't tell Joachim to... Can I go back to my presentation, please? No?
Yes.
There we are. Okay, so this shows precisely what you said. For the other parties in the system, this is the income percentiles that they have. These are local politicians, so they have their own income, and we're not counting the political income. And as you can see, the income percentiles at the top are very much overrepresented in the other parties. So those politicians are doing very well. The Sweden Democrats are not doing better or worse, maybe a little worse than the average, than the rest of the population. So this is by definition is the population, is 1% for each bar, right? But then what we showed in the other paper was that, people come from sort of an amazingly broad set of social backgrounds. So these are the fathers' incomes of these politicians. We measured the politicians in 2011, and we measured the fathers in 30 years earlier, so in the same point of the life cycle. And as you can see, the other parties, they have very even social backgrounds, at least as an aggregate. But the same is true for the Sweden Democrats. So it's not that they belong to families that we're losing. They have the same kind of backgrounds as the regular politicians, but they themselves are not doing too great. And this lowermost graph is, an attempt to answer the question, do you do better than your parents did? So do you have a higher income percentile than your father had 30 years earlier? And for the other parties, this is severely tilted to the right, meaning that very many of these are accomplished people who do better and they are climbing in society, whereas for the Sweden Democrat, if there is a skew, it's in the other direction. So it's something about, current losses, people who are not accomplishing so much, who are getting attracted to the party. I think that's just interesting and fascinating.
Wonderful. If you allow me one more question. So you emphasized how much economic factors seem to be driving this particular voting preference and the politicians standing for these parties. And I'm wondering how much of this is, if you forgive the phrase, a first world problem. So we're talking about Sweden. We're talking about people who are pretty rich by the standards of any society in history, any other country on earth. And their first response to doing badly in relative terms is not to actually go for parties that will do them a favor economically. They're not voting with their pocketbook. They're not going for the traditional left-wing parties that want to expand the welfare state, be more generous on unemployment, etc. They go for identity issues. And maybe the problem or the reason for this somewhat paradoxical response is that they're not really miserable. They're not really poor. It's not that they have to worry where the money for the bread will come from. They're worried where the money for the vacation in Mallorca will come from. And in that sort of luxury space, you then start to go for identity rather than your pocketbook. Is that something that...
Yeah, I think that's probably very true. I didn't have time to develop this, but clearly a lot of these populist radical right movements are identity driven more than traditionally economically driven. You would think that people would vote with the left if they were, very much exposed to economic hardship, but they don't seem to do so. And one reason may be, as you precisely were saying, at least in a relative sense, they think about other people in their own situation. They identify with them, and they say we're all in the same boat, and here is a party that cares about us, and a familiar Trump message, and that's very much along the lines we're thinking.
Very good. Let's open it up to the floor. Are there any questions? Okay, over here, Matthew Goodwin.
Thank you for a really excellent presentation. I wanted to ask a question about the lack of finding around immigration at the local level and just the number of ways that you've measured that around pace of change, level, media exposure, and still not finding anything. And the reason I find that interesting is because if you look at the literature on Trump and also on Brexit, both of those would suggest that at the local level, the local authority or county level, the pace of demographic change is really key, that it's often in areas where you have a sudden shift in population that you get higher support for populism. How can we explain this finding in Sweden? What is it that seems to be playing out differently in Sweden compared to those other cases?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And the reason we were sort of pushing all these measures is that we thought we might find something, particularly since the Sweden Democrat message is so anti-immigrant. You'd think there is a connection. We don't know. We're actually just obtaining an update on our data from Statistics Sweden, which will encompass the period up to 2017, 2018. And that's where you see a dramatic change in immigration. 2015, Sweden got 190,000 migrants on a 10 million population, and that was a really dramatic shock. So it will be interesting to see if we detect those same effects that David and others people have found on dramatic trade shocks in the US and other people have found elsewhere. So I don't know. We're looking forward to running those regressions.
Okay, Kishma.
Thank you. Sticking with the same point, I wondered whether, as you're looking at the data, whether you're going to look at whether the migrant population has differentials within it. For example, if you get visibly different religious differences, geographic differences, versus, on the whole, people who look like you, in other words, Eastern Europeans and intra-European migration. Will you be looking at that? Because that's where I think there's a significant difference in reaction.
Yeah, I think that's also very true. There are some limits in what you can obtain from the data, and country of origin of a migrant is one of those boundaries that you cannot overstep. But you can obtain groupings such as what you said, European, Middle East, etc. And it will be interesting to look at that. Actually, Eastern Europeans are overrepresented as representatives of the Sweden Democrats, but people with the black background are not. Yeah.
Okay.
I think it was very interesting, but this presentation, but I missed a bit about the cultural background. I was brought up in Gothenburg. My granduncle was a member of the party and also a functionary in Metal 41 at the Swedish ball-boring SKF company. And at that time, in the late 60s, to my memory, the canteen on the SKF ball-bearing plant was segregated in one part for Swedish and one for foreign workers who come to work at SKF. Because the Swedish workers, who were all social democrats, they couldn't stand the smell of the garlic and the talk from the Italians, Yugoslavians, and so on. And I think at that time, in the 60s, the Swedish Social Democratic Party was very conservative in social values, and it was also a bit, what to say in Germany, a bit folkish, which we know because Sweden was one of the best collaborators with the Nazi Germany with a social democratic government until the Allies landed in Normandy 1944. They were more collaborating than the Swiss, for example. And if you see this background that you have a social democratic party that was bureaucratic in the top, and it was also very well educated. If you remember the government of Tage Erlander, 1957, they had 8 of the ministers have doctor hats on. Today, Sweden Social Democrats are led by an ombudsman from the LO who pretend to be a welder, but can't even complete a good welder. That means that the standard of the party, the incompetence and the corruption of the Social Democratic Party explains why they have got another, you call it a right-wing party, but it is not more right-wing as Social Democrats was in the 60s. It is right.
Yes.
Okay. There are many things there. For those of you who were not brought up in Göteborg, the reference is made to the periods in the 50s and the 60s where there was huge labor force migration into Sweden. So the big industries really drove down buses to Italy, Greece, Yugoslavia, and other countries in Southern Europe, and brought home workers. And then, as you said, the Social Democrats were ruling at the time. In our data, we don't see the big decline in incompetence that you're referring to. Maybe at the very top in the government you see it, but if you look at politicians at large, you don't see a decline. If anything, you see a higher level among the local politicians. But I think you do have a point, and I would phrase it in terms of the literature on populism. I would phrase it in terms of Ron Inglehart and the Pippa Norris, who say there is always a set of latent populist voters who don't turn populist unless there is two conditions are fulfilled. One is that there is a populist alternative to vote for, and secondly, that they have been hit by some shock, like an economic hardship. And then that's, to me, a relatively good starting point for an interpretation of why previous social democrats, trade unionists, etc., are now turning to the Sweden Democrats in larger numbers. Many of them were hit during the last decades, and that's not the whole explanation. Maybe it's 40% of the explanation, but it's still an important part of it.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Over here, please.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. Taking off from your very last bullet point about the lack of inclusion from fiscal policy, do you think there is I can feel that maybe there's a lesson can be drawn for European fiscal policy going forward? And within the discussion about the possible revision of the fiscal rules within European, can you elaborate a bit on that, please? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know about how to make the connection with the fiscal rules, but there was a unified, more or less, economic support among economists for this idea of making incentivize work versus non-work, and the way the reforms were conducted was to make it more advantageous to work because you got the tax cut condition of having a labor income, and you make it less advantageous to be out of work, so you cut benefits in all kinds of social systems. So it's a double whammy. And many people applauded this and say this will do well. But empirically, it's been very hard to show a large effect of this. And there was this backside of imposing a very large relative income loss, not an absolute income loss, as you were saying, but a relative income loss on a large segment of the population. And maybe people didn't think about that side of things, but to us, it's a integrated part of understanding the rise of the Sweden Democrats. So, maybe since it's such a dominant phenomenon in Europe, one should think about that in other countries too, who contemplate reforms similar to that one.
All right. Thank you so much for a very insightful lecture, and we're going to have a short break now. If you have any questions, maybe over coffee.